all stopping to fill, I'd just like to welcome the Honourable Justice Susan Denham, Chief Justice of Ireland, here this evening. Just basically to go through, essentially, like, as Junior and Senior Counsel, Chief Justice Denham was in charge of many high-profile cases. Then as the first woman elected to the bench of the Supreme Court, she was instrumental in reforming laws across Ireland. And now, as the 11th Chief Justice of Ireland, Chief Justice Denham is the most deserving possible recipient, I think, of the Gold Medal of Honorary Patronage of the University Philosophical Society. So later on you will have a chance to ask her questions. But now it's my great pleasure to present Chief Justice Denham with the Gold Medal of Honorary Patronage and invite her to make an address.
Members of the Council, members of both societies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here this evening at Trinity because, of course, this place holds many personal memories for me and my time as a student here in the 1960s. It was a very different time to now. It was a very exciting time to be an undergraduate at Trinity. We had that kind of zeitgeist of revolution that was in American institutions and right across Europe. And we had debates and we had events in Front Square many days of each term. So it was a very exciting time to be here, and I think that sense we can do things is very much what you get with our generation, not only in Ireland but in other parts of the world as well. I think it's the same kind as I've heard the Clintons talk about their time in college and the way they saw the world, and of course Mary Robinson has talked about her time here and being in Harvard. And it's very much my experience too. This was a very exciting time to be here as an undergraduate, and then I went to Columbia, and at that time it was the Vietnam issue, Vietnam opposition, student, very loud student voices, and the law society, the law section of Columbia is very active, and we went down to Washington and everything, so really very exciting time to be an undergraduate. I always like when I come into college to think of those great times that we had here. And of course I have recently been Pro-Chancellor for about 14 years, and that was a lovely occasion to come in because of course I have committees and things like that, but mostly I have really good news things in the ways of giving out degrees to people, which is lovely for those who are receiving it, but is also particularly lovely for parents and grandparents. And of course, many of the parents and grandparents are friends of mine, so I used to have a great time coming down here to give degrees, and I regret that owing to pressure of work, I had to stop being Pro-Chancellor. Now, we are here in Trinity, this iconic building in the middle of the city, in the middle of Ireland, most important institution for Ireland over the centuries since it's been founded, and has given great people to Ireland, and even on a kind of practical local issue, it's very important as we see all our tourists coming in and seeing the Book of Kells and trying to find Trinity. So in every way, it's an iconic centre to Dublin. And it's such a rewarding experience to be here in a beautiful university in the middle of the city. I don't know whether you still have this. I used to love walking through the college early in the morning. You have this very stillness and the birds singing, and you've got a sense of the city around you. It's time to do great learning, to forge great friendships, and to think about the futures that you're all going to enjoy. And I'd like to thank you very much indeed for the Gold Medal. I'm very honoured, and thank you all very much indeed to follow in the steps of so many important recipients. Statesmen, playwrights, composers, and of course Nobel Peace winners, Archbishop Tutu and F.W. de Clare and John Hume and Lord Trimble, 4 great peacemakers. And as a lawyer, of course, I'm delighted to see previous lawyers who have got it. And Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a member of the Supreme Court in Washington, has been honoured, and I remember actually coming down to that occasion and talking to her. She's a wonderful judge in the court. And indeed, one of the Society's previous presidents was a very important man in Africa in developing the judiciary and legal systems there. That was Sir Egbert Udomo, who was Chief Justice of Uganda in the 60s. He had prior to that been establishing the courts in Nigeria, and he later was a really important judge in the Supreme Court in Nigeria. Of course, we have very important people like Bram Stoker and important writers such as Oscar Wilde, Samuel Beckett. So a tremendous tradition that we can feel around us tonight as we meet once again in Trinity. And you know, Phil is to be congratulated for the role it plays in university. Of course, when I was here, women couldn't be members, but I'm delighted to see that has changed. Phil was founded in the 17th century as a paper reading society for discourse of philosophy, mathematics, and other polite literature. Now, over time, of course, it's evolved to encompass other activities, encouraging documentation of and presentation skills, and speaking and debating. And, you know, this is really an important aspect of our lives, because some people are born with a great skill of debating and wit, but for most of us, these are skills that we have to acquire in the cut and thrust of debate and in practice, learn by participation as we go through our lives. So the Society performs a very important forum for developing these kinds of skills, because, you know, words are so incredibly important. I mean, I deal with them every day, and so do you as students. But think about great phrases that echo down through the centuries and inspire us. Think about Edmund Burke, and so closely connected with the university, and who casts a watchful eye over College Green, where he says, "So truly, it's necessary only for the good man to do nothing, for evil to triumph." This is such a simple sentence, such a truism. And of course, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Incredibly important. It's 50 years or so since he was in Dublin, and I well remember actually going out into Westmoreland Street to see the cavalcade come down, and it was just an extraordinary outpouring from Ireland to this amazing man, such excitement, and he looked as if he really loved being here. And he gave his address, of course, in the Oireachtas, and he posed the question, how can a nation as small as Ireland play such a role on the world stage? And he answered it by a quote from Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who had said, "All the world owes much to the little 5-foot-high nations. The greatest art of the world was the work of little nations. The most enduring literature of the world has come from little nations, and the heroic deeds that thrill humanity through generations were the deeds of little nations fighting for their freedom." And then President Kennedy continued, "It is the quality of the Irish, the remarkable combination of hope, confidence and imagination that is needed more than ever today. The problems of the world cannot possibly be solved by skeptics or cynics whose horizons are limited by the obvious realities. We need men who can dream of things that never were and ask why not." And these, of course, are great wordsmiths, and what they say has left us a powerful legacy. I'm delighted to have this chat today, and addressing you. I'm going to talk about a few specific issues, hopefully in a philosophical way, and point to an anniversary that's coming up in Ireland. Now, in 2012, we are experiencing difficult times in Ireland, and it's a reality which we can't avoid. The recession and the unemployment has impacted on every family in the country. And sometimes people write about how judges are cut off and they're isolated and they're living in a cocoon. They don't really understand what's going on. And Judge Catherine McAleese, another graduate of Trinity, used to get so cross when she said, there am I going around the supermarket, doing my shopping and living my life in the same way as everybody else, and then I read in the newspaper that I'm cocooned and I don't know what's going on in the world. And of course, it is true that we aren't cocooned and we aren't living off in some isolated area. First of all, because we've all been lawyers for 30 or 40 years before we're judges. But secondly, and most importantly, because we actually have the most incredible eye on what is going on in the country, probably more than anybody else in society. When you think about it, every day comes before us people telling us the problems that they have. They've lost a job. Their company has gone bust. They've had to return the shop because they can't pay the rent. We have major millions of cases coming before us where banks and companies are talking to us about billions, and this economic sovereignty of the state is at risk. We have daily families coming into us where there are issues of childcare, where the family is separating, and often because of the stresses that have been brought on by these very difficult times. Now, of course, we can't talk about the people that come before us every day. We can't talk about a case that the HSE has come in today and said we have to take the children. We can't talk about the sergeant who's come in today and said, I've arrested this man, we have to send him back to Timbuktu or wherever it is. We can't talk about this distraught couple who've come in who are trying to separate, who can't afford to separate, and what on earth are they going to do? We don't talk about it because these are matters for the individuals involved. So the fact that we are reticent and that we don't talk about the business of the people before us can sometimes be understood as if we didn't know what was going on. Whereas in fact, perhaps more than even the parish priest, we know more of what's going on in the country. And it's very, very important to us. There's only very few of us. There's only 146 judges in Ireland. And we are the third branch of government. And every day we sit, whether it's in a district court in Dingle or whether it's in the Supreme Court in Dublin, and we hear about the trials and tribulations of the country, and we do the best we can to resolve them. There's a phrase, don't waste a crisis. It's become popular in recent times for not letting a recession go to waste. It's often attributed to Rahm Emanuel, who was President Obama's White House Chief of Staff, and he's now Mayor of Chicago. In November 2008, just as the global economic recession was becoming apparent, he said, "You never let a serious crisis go to waste. And what I mean by that is it's an opportunity to do things you think you could not do before." And that is really true. Difficult times can present opportunities which we would never have imagined, and we can do things that we couldn't have anticipated before. In a community way, it gives us time to rethink our priorities and to think how we lead our lives. And you can see that there's more sport going on than ever before. People are thinking about the priorities in their lives in a way that really maybe had not been thought about in boom years. And in our business world, we see young entrepreneurs. I was talking at various events around the country, and amazingly pleased to see there's young entrepreneurs starting out small businesses in the agricultural area, special products from our green isle, in the IT, on websites, all kinds of areas. Because first of all, those opportunities are there, and this is the time to go for them. And also, there's a slight shift in what people are demanding. I mean, for example, a small example, there are more sweet shops across the country than there have been before the recession. Yeah, but there are all kinds of special opportunities, and as the government is trying to do to support all of you young people, go out there and do your thing and be entrepreneurial. Because you have an education. So With or without a recession, education has always been important in Ireland. We have statistically done well internationally on our place in educating our young people. And we've always valued it, whether you go back to the hedge schools or not. And when you look at, they've recently gone online, the census for 2001 and 2011, and the scholars are the school children. We have always prized, even when we couldn't have second and third level, we always prized education. And my family has lived in Galway for a long time, and the neighbours to us when I was growing up were living in what was then a normal, I'm talking about the 50s, a normal cottage. In other words, there was an earth floor, there was a thatch cottage, they had 6 children. Every single one of them became professional persons with third level education. And that was because the family strived and obtained education for the children. And of course, all those 6 children left Ireland. But we do prize our education. And it's not only for the education we get, it's for what we give to society by being educated, but also what we give to ourselves. It makes life more interesting, makes it, you can anticipate greater things, you can have greater happiness. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said in 1786 of education, he wrote of education as the diffusion of knowledge among people and being the sure foundation for the preservation of freedom and happiness. So really, education is a marvellous thing that we are entitled to. We really have received in Trinity, and we are very fortunate to have had this, as it gives our knowledge and our skills and our opportunity for new horizons. Now, these horizons can be very far-flung lands or places closer at home. I spent some years in the United States, and it was a marvellous adventure, and really enjoyed it. The opportunity in university and practicing law and just seeing another country and a culture. It's a marvellous opportunity, and I always do say to people, even if you don't want to live abroad permanently, just to live in another environment, it makes you think about a lot of things that you maybe just assumed were the norm. And of course we've been doing this forever, the Irish people. We've been travelling the world. I was looking up the phrase of Yeats from September 1913. He said, "The Irish, they have gone about the world like wind." And it's so very true. We've long been a country of emigration. And, I was looking again too at a wonderful book written by Thomas Carroll saying how the Irish saved civilization. Now, it's an entertaining book, and he's talking about how we saved civilization in Europe when our Irish monks went abroad and stopped the destruction in the Dark Ages. He said, "Ireland, a little island at the edge of Europe that has known neither Renaissance or Enlightenment, had one moment of unblemished glory, for as the Roman Empire fell, as all through Europe, nattered, unwashed barbarians descended on the Roman cities, looting artifacts and burning books, the Irish, who were just learning to read and write, took up the great labour of copying all of Western literature, everything they could lay their hands on. Those scribes then served as conduits through which the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures were transmitted to the tribes of Europe, newly settled amid the rubble and ruined vineyards of the civilizations they had overwhelmed. Without the service of the scribes, everything that happened subsequently would have been unthinkable. Without the mission of the Irish monks, who single-handedly refounded European civilization throughout the continent, in the bays and valleys of their exile, the world came after them would have been an entirely different world, a world without books, and our own world would never have come to be. Now, it is a little bit over the top, but it does recognise our Europeanization from over 1,000 years ago, and the place that we played in it at that time. And of course now we fast forward to the 20th century, 21st century, where during the boom started to have a net increase in migration. And in the early 2000s, we had many migrants from Eastern Europe as they joined the European Union. And we're now in the situation where 500,000 in our island are new Irish who were born abroad, 12% of our population. And that's an extraordinary figure for a small country like ourselves. But now, of course, the cycle has come again and we've got back into emigration. And then many are leaving for work and improved living standards. And some hopefully will return and some will stay abroad and live their lives abroad. And going abroad is an exciting thing. I mean, we don't want to lose all our young people, but it's not just a negative thing. Going abroad is very exciting. And Tim Coogan wrote a book, Wherever Green is Born, the story of the Irish diaspora. And of course we have the United States where so many people, and we have Australia where so many people have gone. And but there is even more so. If you go up to Newfoundland and talk to people in English there, that's the old cod fishing area. Those were Irish from Waterford 100 years ago, and they still have a slight Waterford accent. If you go to the campus in South America, Irish farmers went from the Midlands over 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago, and they still regard themselves as Irish and have Irish roots and have a slightly Irish accent and look Irish. And of course our teachers and religious have travelled all over Asia and Africa. And we have growing contacts with South America. So it's an amazing world of opportunity. Since the university has been founded, therefore, our graduates have gone all over the world. And many have gone to Australia. And I was just reading, again, a book I read some years ago called First Fleet to Federation. And it's about Australia and about Trinity's place in Australia. And from 1788, when the first boats came to Botany Bay to colonize, our Trinity graduates have been there. On the first ships, the surgeon was a Trinity graduate of Jameson, and he became the principal surgeon and surgeon of the new colony of New South Wales. But I have always found the law and the lawyers so fascinating because during about 100, 150 years, very nearly all the judges in Australia were Irish. Many, if not most of them, were Trinity graduates. Roger Peary and John Hubert Talcott, both active supporters of Daniel O'Connell, went out and became judges. In the 19th century, 7 of the Chief Justices in Australia were Trinity men. Of course, they were all men because no women lawyers. The first judicial officers to arrive in Victoria, Edward Brewster, and the first judge, and James Croke, they were both Trinity graduates. And Robert Mosborough, who became Chief Justice of the Court of Mines and was a key developer of Victoria, was a Trinity graduate. And indeed, the bar roll in 1840 in New South Wales, out of the 24 barristers, 8 were Trinity men. And the most extraordinary thing about it is, when you look through this list of judges and lawyers in Australia, you have all of these Trinity men who tend to be establishment people. But you then had people who had been in rebellions. You had John Mitchell, you had William Smith O'Brien, and Charles Gavin Duffy, and many others who were either found to be guilty of treason, or who, I think in one of them, there was 5 trials, and he was never found to be guilty, but he was then deported to Tasmania anyway. And the extraordinary thing about it is that here we have the 2 traditions of Ireland, which were having difficulty with each other here on this island. But when they went to Australia, they became the judges and the lawyers for Australia. And that has continued even down to recent times, up until, for 100 years, up until 1950. all the Chief Justices of Victoria were Trinity people. And now in Australia, most of the lawyers or judges are of Irish descent. And some years ago, the Chief Justice of Australia, Chief Justice Mason, came and he was speaking to us about various judicial matters. And on the Supreme Court of Australia, which is called the High Court, at that time, there was only one member of the court that wasn't of Irish extraction. So we have an incredible legacy in Australia, but all around the world you can find this legacy of Trinity people and Irish people. And in fact, it's not necessary to go away and stay away or go away for a long time and then come back. I was just looking up in 1946, Frances Moore, who's the Senior Counsel, the first Senior Counsel in all of these islands, the first woman Senior Counsel in all of these islands. She was Regius Professor of Laws here at that time. She travelled to Nuremberg to attend trials, and she was invited to see the private information that was there, to sit during the hearing, and she attended 6 of the tribunal hearings, and she was given access to the court documents. And then on her return, she came, and in this room, she told a meeting at the college all about the Nuremberg trials. So we are a well-travelled race, and in fact, we are part of an extraordinary group of people, because all over the world, there are 70 million people of Irish extraction, and of those 70 million, 6 live on this island. So certainly when you travel abroad, doors are opened and one is welcomed. And of course we recognise this special position after the Good Friday Agreement when the Constitution was amended and Article 2 was put in, and it says the Irish nation cherishes its special affinity with people of Irish ancestry living abroad who share its cultural identity and heritage. And it's really an important statement there. And it's an extraordinary thing that we belong to. And it is resonated when we travel abroad that here we are in our state, 45 million, but we are part of 70 million people on the planet. The final specific point I wanted to say to you was about the Constitution of Ireland, which of course is very important to judges and lawyers and to the people of Ireland. Because on the 29th of December, our Constitution will be 75 years old. And it was the first free Constitution that was adopted by our people. And it was an extraordinarily prescient document for its time, because it came to be in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, Europe was in a very dark time. Think about what was going on in Germany. Think about the rise of the Nazis. Think about the problems in other nations. The lights were going out over Europe. And yet in this tiny island off an island in the Atlantic, we were writing our first constitution, and we put into it fundamental rights. And we put them in a way that had not been put extensively in other jurisdictions. For example, one of the examples I always like to put in is that we recognise the dignity of the individual. Now, that wasn't in constitutions at that time. Today it is, because when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came into being after the Second World War, it was part of it. And today, in modern constitutions, you find it. But we led the way in the 1930s in saying that the dignity of a person is important. And it may well be that we were thinking about it in a way you might think about it today, but it also might be because under our British law, there was a very special concept of dignity, and it was an offence to shame a person. So there's a real concept, and so although British law is in part and parcel of our law today, maybe it's by osmosis, or whether it was actually thought about, because the people who really wrote this constitution is often said to be De Valera's constitution, but more and more we're realising how it was written, and by a lot of good work that's going on at the moment. And one of the really excellent people working on it is Gerard who's now a judge of the High Court, and he's just brought out an excellent book on the origins of the Constitution. But there were also people like Stephen Roach, who was a civil servant, and there was Arthur Masson, who was another civil servant. And both of them were Trinity graduates. And they were very learned lawyers. And they looked at the constitutions around Europe, Latin America, and they gave a great deal of thought to our constitution. So in other countries, people have done great research on who wrote our constitution, who were the authors, how did it develop. And this is just beginning to happen here. And there's a great deal of research yet to be done about these individuals, two of them being Trinity graduates, and how they developed this whole constitution, which was an extraordinarily prescient constitution for its time. So in conclusion, Ireland will recover from its present difficulties. To you students here tonight, I say how fortunate you are to have attended this university. You and your education are the key to transforming Ireland and the world. Don't become despondent by a lot of the gloom and doom that you hear around. You can never flourish as individuals or a community or a society by being negative or harking back to yesterday. We must look forward to tomorrow with confidence. Be adventurous, carpe diem. And President Clinton was speaking in Limerick just a short time ago, and he caught this, which I think is a very important approach. He said, today's current economic crisis will pass, and your education will endure. And it's very important that, just as making peace, the Irish throw off the heavy hand of history to grasp for a brighter future, we throw off the burden of the current economic crisis to imagine a different future. What an education is a range of possibilities. It's a gift of personal freedom. It's a chance to make the most of, in spite of the troubles, the moment. And it's very interesting because that really echoes what T.K. Whittaker said in 1961. T.K. Whittaker was, as you know, a great civil servant, and he was really the architect of the economic recovery of Ireland in the 50s. And I actually talked to him several times before I was trying to introduce changes in our courts and our structure, because he's truly a great man, able to achieve things. It's okay to write reports, but no good if they're going to sit on a shelf. And he also stressed this important attitude of think positive, because he stated the psychological factor, which in my view is, and for a long time will remain, the most important factor of production in Ireland. It means it's vital to have an attitude of enterprise and progress. Such an atmosphere shall not allow ourselves to be overawed by future difficulties or to fall into despondency by reason of temporary reverses and setbacks. And that was said at 61, and you could say it today as well. But it's so important to remain positive and strive for the very best in your education and your life. Because we have received a great gift by our education in this university. And thank you all very much for inviting me to be here.
I just have a question on judicial activism and the role it plays. At the point where the legislators aren't legislating, where do you think the courts are?
Well, we really don't have much choice. I mean, judges don't want to be making law, because that's the role for Parliament. But we don't set our agenda. Our agenda is set by the people who bring cases. So I can't say, well, now, I think we should do a case about contract because we really should straighten out the law of contract. It depends on what case comes before the court. And if a case comes before the court where there is no law and we have to try and sort it out, we can't say, well, I'll adjourn it until Parliament has done something. So judges don't wish to be activists because they want to keep the separation of powers right. But sometimes they're put in situations where they have to resolve a dispute and they have to resolve it. And that's one thing about common law. Common law is a very practical thing as opposed to civil law. You know, we look to the law and we try to resolve disputes.
Yeah, just a second question. Just you spoke about the Elizabethan society and how women weren't allowed in when you were in college here, and how I think you were one of two females in your class. So there's no doubt that when you were rising in the legal profession, it was a very male-dominated thing. Do you feel that there's been major improvements to that, whereby it's been resolved? And do you sort of to what extent do you identify yourself as the first female Supreme Court?
Well, of course, it is radically different. I mean, when I was in college, we had to leave college by midnight. There were 2 women in every year in law school. I don't know how that was achieved. When I was in college now, there was no women judges. There were no women senior counsel. And in fact, when I began to practice in the beginning of the 70s, and there were only 2 women practicing law. Now, there were about 8 women at the bar doing really important work on conveyancing and probate work, but not litigating in court. And Mary Robinson and I were the 2 litigators. She was practicing in Dublin and in Galway, and I was practicing in Dublin and in the Midlands. And we were the only women. And so, I don't know if any of you have yet gone down, you law students. On Mondays, we have a sort of a motion day in the High Court, in the 4 courts. And so there's hundreds of cases on, and there's masses of people in court. And I remember going into the courts on those days and being the only woman in the courtroom with the judge, the registrar, all the court staff, and all the other barristers and solicitors being men. And that is a very unhealthy way for things to be. And so I'm absolutely delighted that we're getting into a more equal situation, because we should reflect our society, which is 50 approximately. But, and also I remember when I became a Supreme Court judge, several people said to me, I just went into the court just to see a woman on the court, just because then I felt it belonged to me and it wasn't just for men. So I think it's important that women are in all public life, because we should be there. But having said all that, it was just extraordinary the first day that I did sit at the Supreme Court, because we have a room behind the Supreme Court where we have our conference and we meet and we work. And that first day, when I went in to sit at the conference table, and no woman had ever sat there before, I did just feel the history and, feel about the women who, since the beginning of the century, the 19th, 20th century, had been working for women in law, people who had worked aggressively and people who were pacifists. And because in 1921 we had the first women called to the bar, but they didn't practice. And then in 1960 we had, I can't remember quite the date, it was somewhere in the 60s, we had the first district court judge woman. And it was until Nella Carroll became a judge in the 80s, that first High Court judges, So we're talking about 100 years of striving, and you don't do it in one generation. I was lucky to be at the end of that long line, because it was really incredible work that was done from the 19th, really from the flappers, the suffragettes, until extraordinary thing to have lived through.
I just want to ask whether, as a barrister or a judge, what do you feel is the most interesting case you've been involved in?
Well, I have enjoyed. When I started out, I was a junior counsel, and I was on the Midland Circuit. And, I had wonderful cases for farmers about rights of way, about marning, that's the border between farms, about issues in relation to cattle, and about issues arising on these small towns. And I really loved that because you really got to know Ireland. You got to know all about the agricultural problems, you got to know all about the problems in small towns and the social welfare issues. So I really couldn't pick one case out of that. Then when I became a silk and I was really just working in Dublin, I specialised in judicial review. And at that time, I was representing the state in an awful lot of extradition cases. And they were alarming and very remarkable at the time. So I think probably some of those, because that was at a time when we were having trouble with our neighbour, and we haven't resolved it, which we have now, which is excellent. So I think those were probably the cases that I always remember.
Would anybody in the audience like to ask a question at this point?
You were talking about the dignity of the individual.
Sorry, say it again.
You were talking about the dignity of the individual in the Constitution, and I was wondering, are there any aspects of the dignity of the person that you feel aren't being adequately protected in Ireland?
Well, dignity is very wide-ranging, and it may well be an issue in an important case that's going on at the High Court, which may well be appealed to the Supreme Court. So I think I'll probably just say I think it's an important human right.
Would anyone else like to ask?
You're speaking there a lot about education and about fundamental rights. My question, I suppose, is that given that the Constitution enshrines particular fundamental rights that necessarily require money and expenditure on behalf, on the government's part, at what point do you think it's the court's duty to step in and enforce those constitutional rights by a mandatory order and kind of slap under the powers that be as well? Do you think it's to do with the courts at all?
Well, we haven't in our Constitution set out a lot of social rights, such as a right to a home, and unlike in some constitutions, which you find it, where they have the right, but they haven't been able to enforce it, the courts can't enforce it. We are very conscious of the separation of powers between the three branches of government. Of course, every case involves some money. You know, every case you decide involves some expense. So it's not just a question of money, it's a question also of being very careful not to invade another area. But it is one of those lines which are very complex sometimes. You're absolutely right.
I know you've written sort of extrajudicially before about some of the inefficiencies in the Irish courts, some particularly in terms of waiting times. I know you wrote asking for court of appeal a couple of years ago. So I think during the summer it looks like, or last summer it looks like we're going to now get a court of civil appeal. So I'm just wondering what other sort of practical steps you will identify as being necessary to make the Irish court system more efficient.
Well, the Court of Appeal is a critical issue, and the government have said that we are going to have it. We're the only Commonwealth country in the world where you don't have a Court of Appeal. So we have all of these vast numbers of cases started in the High Court, where there are 38 courts. And you have a right, constitutional right to appeal from that court to the Supreme Court, where there are only 8 judges and they sit in 2 divisions. And that is a logjam. And we also have to hear all as a Court of Criminal Appeal, we sit as the presiding judge in the Court of Criminal Appeal, and we also have cases coming as cases stated from the Circuit Court. So we are in a situation which is unsustainable, and the government have agreed to that, and they are moving towards having a referendum. Now, unfortunately, we have to have a referendum because in other Commonwealth countries, the Parliament can introduce superior courts. In our constitution, the government can introduce circuit courts and district courts, what are called inferior courts of jurisdiction. But unfortunately, in our constitution, you have a constitutional right to appeal from the High Court to the Supreme Court. So therefore, to break that, we have to have a referendum. say there can be a Court of Appeal and you can have your right of appeal to the Court of Appeal. And as in most countries, you have an automatic right of appeal and then only go to a Supreme Court on a point of exception of public importance. So it is a really important thing at the moment because there are very long delays and it's very unfair and unjust to have delays in our court. So I am hoping that this will, as the government have said, that they will develop this and that we'll have a referendum on this next year. But also I think it's very important that I would like to see family courts introduced. A system of family courts such as you get in Australia where they're separate from the courts and they are manned by people who are judges who are knowledgeable in family courts and they have an infrastructure which helps people in the family court structure. And I think that would be just a superb thing to introduce in Ireland for the people who have to be before the courts. It would be a specialist courts for people in family lawyers. So I'd like to, those would be the two things that I would really think would be very good for the court system.
Okay, and Lydia, would you like to? Yeah.
Thank you, Judge, first of all, for coming to speak to us today. Can I just ask, today you handed in the judgment in relation to the funding of the U.S.A. in the referendum, the recent referendum of the children's rights referendum. Now, while I don't want to ask you to comment on that specifically, I wanted to ask, how do you sort of strike a balance between what was a sort of common consensus that the improvements to children's rights were a good thing, and yet ultimately the method by which we achieved that was wrong on the part of the government? How do you sort of square that balance? Because ultimately we achieved something good, but it was achieved incorrectly.
Well, I can't comment on the case, not only because of that case, but because of other cases coming up. But really it's a question of the rule of law. I mean, we had established in law that public funds could not be used for one side in referendum commission, and that judgment is now absolutely consistent with a code of practice across Europe that has been developed since that and is consistent with, for example, Australian law in relation to it. So it really is just a question of law. I mean, it wasn't a question of striking any balance there. The law was that you couldn't do this, and it was a question of the rule of law.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Is there anybody in the audience looking at?
I just have a question in relation to the children's referendum. Do you believe that the Constitution provision goes far enough for the protection of children, or do you believe it's a step in the right
I'm afraid there's going to be a lot of litigation about that. So I can't, because we have a system that if you have written and if you've spoken in favour of one side on a case, and if you formed a view on one side of a case, you are recused from the court. So you can't sit in the court. And so I'm very careful to maintain an open mind on all sides, so that when all of these get out, because we're going to have a lot of litigation about this. So I'm sorry. No.
Is there anybody else who'd like to ask?
Do you think that judges ever truly divorce their own idiosyncrasies and subjective life perspectives when they're making decisions, or is there something subconsciously that's always going to be there with every judge that affects how they make decisions?
Well, we're human beings, so I mean, you just have to. You obviously we're not robots, but we are trained to look at the law and to look at the facts, and we take an oath that we will do that. And there is a very high standard of integrity in the Irish judiciary. There always has been. And so, insofar as anybody can do it, that is what is done day in, day out by all judges. And often you would find that a decision that might be made might in fact be would be a matter of law, but that particular judge wouldn't share the view. Might think it was a good law or whatever, but that's the law. They've taken an oath that that's what they're going to enforce. So I think that's as best I can do on that.
This is also the last question here from James.
I hope you're able to comment on this one. It's a bit less serious. I was just wondering, it's getting close to Christmas. Do you have a favourite Christmas song?
listen to the choir. Thanks very much.
Cheery down to finish on. So just on behalf of the Law Soc and Phil, Chief Justice, let me really sincerely thank you for coming out and for your speech. I think Law Soc are incredibly lucky to have you as honorary president of their society. Now we're very lucky to have you as an honorary patron of ours. So if we can have a parting round of applause for Chief Justice Susan Denham.
Thank you very much.